All right. So, welcome to Late Round Speaking. Um, this is going to be a lecture mostly focused on rebuttal in late round speaking and how to keep your argumentation fresh, especially in rounds that are getting increasingly containing 16, 18, 20 kids, when many of us on our home circuits don't face that same scale. This is sort of a roadmap to try to make sure that low precedence or just a planned late round speech is not going to be the silver bullet that takes you out, especially because late round speaking is really important. And I'll be getting into that a little bit more lately. So, a little bit about me. So, my name is Rhys Adams. You may know me, you may not. I've been debating congressional debates since 2022 and later public forums since 2023. In 2024, I was the NCFL national champion and the Yale Invitational champion. I've won two state championships in Massachusetts, and I was the second NSDA runner-up in 2024 for House congressional debate. Um, and aside from debate, I engage in student publications, I engage in musical theater, and a little bit of organizing with some high school Democrats. But regardless of any of these tournaments that are listed here, not all of them were places where I was very happy with my late round performance. And I think that sometimes you can um, sort of get bogged down in in a in a streak of going early speech, early speech, early speech, early speech, and developing yourself as a debater and an orator in a way that is more akin to congressional oratory than congressional debate. And so I have had a big journey with my late round speaking, and so I sort of want to share that with you here. So I'm going to start with like what is late round speaking, then I'm going to talk about the importance of concession, which is something I've learned from other debate events. Then I'm going to talk about reframing, which is something that I've been doing for a while and I have a lot of opinions on. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about breadth and depth and how to deal with those things. And then finally, we're going to talk about rhetoric because that I think is probably the weakest point in late round speaking for most congressional debaters, using myself sort of as an example. So in general, I define late round speaking as any speech in the final quarter of a round. So the raw numerical placement is going to vary. So it's not necessarily, oh, it's a ninth speech, it's a 10th speech, it's this, it's that. It's more so the period in the round that matters. And in general, I would say that respect for your round placement is a good thing. It's an important thing because as much as everybody wants to give this rousing speech that mostly focuses on themselves, and doesn't engage in a lot of rebuttal, or as much as other people might want to have a heavily rebuttal-based speech where they're just going line by line through their opponent's contentions or through the other side's assertions, that does not fit into every point in the round. And so what I mean by respect for round placement is that if you are delivering a speech in the final quarter of a round, it should appear as though it is meant for the final quarter of the round. And so judges are often commenting like, oh, this felt like it was a pre-written speech. This felt like a pre-written speech. And if you don't have a pre-written speech, that can feel very frustrating or it can feel frightening. Like you're being accused of like, oh, you came in with this product when perhaps you did write something in round. But the structure is what is going to give you the appearance of a late round speech and the appearance of a speech that fits the needs of the round. And so a round that is well explained um, is going to have judges being more comfortable and more consistent in how they are doing their ranks and their ballots. And so that's going to give debaters a better chance. It's going to give you a better chance. And so if you do find yourself in the final quarter, it's better to focus on these things like clarity than it is to come out with this barnstorming rhetoric. But we'll talk about rhetoric in a little bit because there's a place for strong rhetoric in late round. But the first thing that is super important here is concession. And this is a big way that you can signal that you're doing a late round speech and a big way that you can do it well without running out of time. So in other forms of debate, concession is well understood. And it's become a very commonplace thing where contentions just won't even get brought up if they're conceded, which is totally fine and makes a lot of sense for those events, but it doesn't make sense for Congress because Congress, you're trying to communicate with the informed public. And so you don't want to be sort of slyly dropping contentions without explaining them. But at the same time, you don't want to get bogged down in winning every single point of clash. And judges won't find that believable. If you have a bill, for example, about instituting a military aid or a law enforcement aid package to Haiti, judges are not going to believe that there are no cons of that. And so if you are arguing on the affirmation that every single point, every single concern that the negation has brought up is wrong, is nonsensical, you're not going to have as much credibility with them. So it's better in late round to acknowledge that both sides have their flaws, both sides have pros and cons, but that you have an impact that supersedes everything else that's been mentioned in the round. And so a lot of people will call that like weighing. And so weighing is important, like numerical weighing, I think, is something that we miss a lot. The description of like we have two raw empirics of an impact to carbon in the atmosphere. There's an increase due to this bill, and there's a decrease due to this bill. If the increase is larger, then that's of concern. I mean, lives often get brought up too, for that numerical weighing thing. I mean, that's obviously dangerous territory to be going into, but it is still a numerical basis upon which to weigh your arguments. Dollars, it's super easy as well. If you're talking about something to do with a balanced budget, it's very easy to say this bill will bring in this much revenue, but will also lead to this many outlays. And so that weighing is important, but to enable yourself to do that, you have to concede a lot of points of clash. And so there's a stock way to concede points of clash, which is to say, I will be the first person on my side to actually agree with the other side. And sometimes you're not the first, sometimes you're like the third person doing that. And so right off the bat, that is not getting you as far as it could be. But also, you don't have to argue the other side's points for them. Like in longer form debates, this is a good thing to do because it shows that you understand the other side. Um, a lot of like professional debaters do this a lot. Like Jordan Peterson, for example, will like restate the points of the people that he's arguing against, which something more so he did before he went on his recent kick, where he's gotten a lot more intense and unyielding. But everybody does it across the political spectrum as a way to create a bond with their counterpart, whether or not that's an opponent. And that I just don't think is always fitting into the 3 minute speech time frame. And so I think that in congressional debate, you have to be careful about that. As much as it feels good to really in detail explain the other side's points, you have to find a time and a place to do that. So if you're in a late round speech, be aware that there will already be rebuttals and mid-round speeches that have said, I agree in some capacity with the other side, with the affirmation, with the negation. And so you don't have to come out and say, I agree with them. I'm going to make this groundbreaking point that no, they're actually right. And their arguments are going to have been beaten into the ground, like Saudi Arabia, arms embargo, for example. On the negation, you're going to have heard many, many times that Saudi Arabia has already shifted away from the United States. And so an arms embargo is not going to lead to a market increase in Saudi Arabia's friendliness to Russia or China. So if you're on the affirmation and you think that too, you don't need to come in at the end and say, yes, I agree with that completely, and I'm going to make all of these arguments for it, because at that point, judges will have heard it so much that it's kind of accepted. It gets into their mind by repetition, and they don't need more convincing. So you don't need to convince them of the points of the other side. The mere fact that you're agreeing with them as somebody who is supposed to be opposed to it is going to lend it credibility. So what instead you should do is you should segue as quickly as possible from that concession into how your impacts are still the most important. So you could say it's not about shifting to Russia or China or whatever. It's about acting as a rogue state, or it's about like having a greater diplomatic schism with Qatar and the Gulf Cooperation Council, and how that's going to stop the ability to negotiate in the Middle East. That is the quickest way you can do it, but it starts with that concession. So just say, I I will take the affirmation at their highest ground that this, and this are right, and then you begin. You've established credibility, and now you've set the scene for a much clearer field of play where there aren't six concepts swirling around in judges' heads. It's just one thing that you are going to hammer home in your speech. So then reframing is another super important thing that you can do in late round speeches to attract attention and not just crystallize. Everybody in Congress has been taught at some point to do a crystal where you just repeat everything everyone said in the round and draw some genius insight from it. And that can be effective. There are people who do it really well, but I would say two things. One, those people are few and far between. It is a difficult skill to synthesize the round without simply repeating everything everyone's heard and sort of boring people with like a lack of new content. And second, the ability to introduce new lines of thought or the ability to think critically is not reserved for the first two-thirds of the debate. So that doesn't mean you should be introducing new contentions per se, or you should be introducing new evidence that like is slightly modifying the way we think about a contention. But what it does mean is that you should still be able to think and not just repeat what everybody else on your side has said and then add new rhetoric or add slightly new signposting that indicates your round placement. So there are three ways to do reframing that I find work very well for me. So the first is what I call a new layer of analysis. And so it's not quite the same as a new contention because it should be more than a contention, because a new contention people are ultimately going to get a little bit tired of or frustrated with because they've heard so many contentions already. And the likelihood of your new contention, A, having such a vast impact that it doesn't come across as really niche, and B, having no relation whatsoever to the other contentions that people have brought up is rather low. And so, if, for example, you have a bill about increasing surveillance at the US-Mexico border, and you come in late round with a contention about how the government of Texas could stop women from going to Mexico to seek reproductive health care, that is not the right place to do that because the rate of that happening is astoundingly low. And so, if you want to do it at the very top of your speech or at the very top of the round to indicate sort of the attitude you feel like it perpetuates, like even if like that's happening to one person, it is it's absolutely of concern to your judges and to the American people because it comes across as morally repugnant, which it is. So if you want to use that as an example to say surveillance allows the government too significant of a role in people's personal lives, then that's great, and you should do it at the top of the debate. But if you're introducing it as this new thing that's going to completely shake up the whole impact calculus of the round, 75% of the way in, that's not going to do what you expect it to do. So a new layer of analysis is not a new contention. A new layer of analysis is something that reframes each and every contention. And so I think the most common one of these that I see is the expansion of the scope from national or domestic to international politics. And I see this a lot in economic bills. So, for example, anything to do with pharmaceutical companies, like you could say a bill to regulate pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, or a bill to cap prescription drug prices, or a bill to ban the use of artificial intelligence in prescription drug pricing, or to ban advertisements for prescription drugs or for any sorts of pharmaceuticals. That is going to be a very domestic oriented debate. And so you will sometimes see the efficacy of coming in late round and saying, so we've heard everything everyone else has said, but we're going to expand the scope to be international. And we're going to add the framing of trade. For example, trade is a topic that has been on everybody's minds recently because of the slew of tariffs, reciprocal and otherwise, that have been introduced by the United States this year. And so, if you then start talking about how capping prescription drug prices is ultimately another form of a trade barrier, right? Then you can access all of everybody else's rhetoric that they've already made in their contentions about, oh, this is the impact that it's going to have on the companies, this is the impact it's going to have on the pharmacies, but you can frame it with this new language and maybe one or two new sources that gives it freshness in people's mind and is a truly unique way of taking it on. Or for the example of artificial intelligence in medical decision making, an example that I have used is the way in which artificial intelligence has been used to sideline the needs, the medical needs, sort of the drugs that would be servicing people in countries in the global south who do not have as large of a consumer base in terms of money. And so if you expand the scope from, oh, we are seeing a chance that pricing is going to be prohibitive to lower income people in the United States for a drug like semaglutide. And then if you expand that level to international, you highlight that these drug companies are multinational corporations, which again is adding new language that people are familiar with, and you expand the impact. So new layer of analysis, the example I took is domestic international, but you can also use the example of for example, like a local versus federal discussion, right? So oftentimes we'll hear the impacts of a bill nationwide, and that's great because they come with a lot of statistics about this is how this is going to impact the whole nation. But there is also a benefit to sometimes zooming in on specific examples on the state and local levels, which elucidate the inconsistencies, right? So if a bill, for example, is going to like increase the GDP 1%, and this is an example that you're never going to find, but I think it's an effective one or an effective analogy. Increase the GDP 1% by like supercharging the economic progress of, say, a state like Georgia, while like leading to a complete depression or collapse in another state like Indiana, then that is of concern. And so you have a composition fallacy of looking at things on too big a level and not zooming into the disparate impacts that are contained within that. Um, and so, like anything to do with like industrial manufacturing is going to necessarily focus more on one region of the United States. But there are inherent harms to everybody of having one region lag behind the rest of the country. Similarly, the US loses like $800 billion in lost economic gains simply due to our high levels of um, racial wealth inequality and then also lack of social mobility. So if you can highlight that there are disparate impacts and how that really holds everybody back, then that is another good new layer of analysis that is admissible in late round as long as you're relying on what other people have already said. So that's crucial. So these new layers of analysis need to be harking back to what other people, preferably on your side, have done a good job of establishing. And that's another thing to be aware of. Just because somebody on your side or another debater in the round said something doesn't really mean that they convinced the judges, right? And so there is a lot of value in rigorously and critically evaluating the arguments of your own side and taking a fine-tooth comb through them and assessing them for how almost bulletproof they are. And so if a bulletproof argument is made on your side, then that is the absolute best thing that you could be referencing with this new layer of analysis reframing. Second, and this one I think is the most effective, a favorable dichotomy. And so in this situation, you're going to have an if-then framing in your speech early on. It's going to be the thesis. So if this bill does this, then that is going to have X impact. If this bill does that, it is going to have Y impact. And so many debates splinter like this. People don't know what the bill is going to do. And so you have people on one side saying, well, X impact is great and we should be welcoming it. And you have the other side saying, let's actually, yeah, we acknowledge that X impact is a good idea, but Y impact is actually going to happen, which is going to be completely catastrophic. And so that is the way that 80% of debates are going to terminate with a question about what is going to ultimately happen, right? There's a plausibility question. So it's not necessarily always good and bad things are going to happen, and everybody agrees on that. It's, are these good things going to happen? Are these bad things going to happen? And so a way where you can sort of rise above that common dead end that a lot of debates get into is by presenting a favorable dichotomy where you can say, if this, then impact X, which is positive, or if that, then impact Z, which is positive. And so an example that comes to mind for me is I debated a bill to mandate greater algorithmic transparency for social media companies. And there was a lot of argumentation on the neg side, I was asked, that stated that there was no benefit to increasing algorithmic transparency when ultimately like these companies didn't have very much to hide. So they had already established their business practices, and anything they were hiding was not going to be revealed by the algorithm. So this was ultimately like a useless road to walk down. So an argument that I found that was sort of strong in countering that was by saying, so if the algorithms are revealing that there are business practices or that there are sort of content regulation practices that have been concealed or that have been hidden by these companies, then that's positive because we expose wrongdoing. And like a disclaimer, this is relying on like a large oversimplification of the meaning of the word algorithm, but that often happens in policymaking because policymakers are not experts in new technology. But then I said, if the opposite happens and you are finding consistencies rather than inconsistencies when you mandate transparency, then that provides the opportunity to create greater trust in these corporations when a lack of trust in these corporations has been fueling our greater lack of societal trust for the last 10 or 15 years. So I can say, yes, if we go down this one road that the AF thinks is more plausible, then we've achieved something and done something good. But if we go down this other road that the neg thinks is more plausible, then there's also a benefit. And so if you can establish a favorable dichotomy late in round, again, by relying on other people's arguments, by saying, yes, these arguments are good, these arguments make sense, pulling from things that you think the judges will already believe, but you back the other side into a corner by saying that no matter which direction the fork in the road takes, that it still resolves to your side, then you're in a very good place. And so a favorable dichotomy is super effective. So in the neg world, we still see a benefit. In the app world, we still see a benefit. Um, Another example I think of is when I recently debated lowering electric vehicle tariffs. And the neg thought it was a lot more plausible that um, in a neg world, that Chinese companies who were was lowering electric vehicle tariffs on China, that Chinese companies who were currently manufacturing in China, manufacturing electric vehicles with Chinese materials, were gradually going to continue moving their operations to Mexico because Mexico has much freer trade with the United States, as opposed to ultimately being targeted by the tariffs in China. And so you see two scenarios that are essentially made out. And here I think this actually favors the neg because you have a scenario in which companies move to Mexico to avoid the tariffs, which is good because Mexico has more robust labor standards and a more common market with the United States. So we should want things to be moved to Mexico from China. Or you see that these companies are facing regulation from the tariffs, which then means that US companies are more competitive. So you have this scenario where both sides are very impassioned about where these companies are going to move their operations, their manufacturing. And if you can cut through that tension at the end of the debate and say that if there is a remain in China policy, then the United States consumer benefits, which again relies on making a defense for tariffs, which can be hard to do, but you will find yourself having made that argument if you were on the nag, or you will find your side having made that argument. So it's fine because you can rest on the credibility of that. But then also say that if we do see a situation of outsourcing or relocation to Mexico, then that's also good. And then the final one is a little bit shorter and or simpler, and that is just by using the sort of political trick of the moderation of your own side's arguments and the radicalization of the other side's arguments. And this doesn't require any new contentions. This just requires stating very simply what the bill means. And so if you were on the negation, a lot of bills that get submitted in congressional debate are, I would say, they're on the frontier of the possible. You see a bill sometimes that is pretty outlandish. And people on the affirmative will find good arguments for it because, they're crafty and that's what you've come to expect. But the elephant in the room is that the bill is just a strange, bizarre piece of legislation that would never make its way before the actual United States Congress. And as such, these moderation radicalization impacts are super good because at the end, you can just say, this is what this bill does. Isn't that a little crazy? Isn't that a little bizarre? And so, something to do not as your whole reframing speech, not as your whole late round speech, but a good thing to do nonetheless is to offer another summary of what the bill does. So the first two speeches of the round are technically supposed to explain what the bill does. I've seen people shift away a lot from doing that, which I think is a loss for the event. But let's say that they did. Once you're 16 speeches in, it's probably a best practice to do that again. Explain the mechanisms of the bill, explain the sections, and explain their potential impacts and ramifications as told by your fellow congresspeople or your fellow senators. If you can do that and bring together the speech that really helpfully criticized Section 3A and the speech that was eviscerating Section 2B, then you can create a comprehensive crystal or a comprehensive argument against the bill. And so that's what crystallization really means. It means pulling together disparate impacts and disparate arguments into a grander narrative or a more broad-reaching narrative about what this bill does. And so on the affirmation, you should do that by moderating what the bill seems to be doing or what the bill seems to want. Because ultimately, most Americans favor things that are moderate over things that are radical in economic policy, in foreign policy, despite the fact that polls indicate that Americans do believe that America is on the wrong track and has been on the wrong track for a number of years. People are wary of huge sweeping reforms to target that. And so that's a bit of a paradox and it's somewhat contradictory. But that's the environment that you have to acknowledge that you're in. That's the environment that most of your competitors and judges exist in. That's the environment that you exist in. And so it's not that you should only argue for moderate things, it's that you are allowed to present them in a way that is reasonable or in a way that seems less radical than perhaps the other side in their late round speeches would be painting them to be. And so that's why when Bernie Sanders says this is not a radical proposition, he gets cheers. It's not because he hates radicalism or he doesn't believe in changing the system. It's because it is seen as something intrinsically good not to be radical, even by people who do believe in change. And so radical in the United States almost always has a negative connotation, and moderate or reasonable or mild tends to have a positive one in politics. And so that's not something to love or hate, that's just something to be aware of. And so by explaining the bill in vivid detail and either making it sound very radical, which it often is, or by explaining how this is reasonable, this has been done before, this has been pursued by 37 countries, Belgium has pulled this off, we could do this. Then you start to give judges a better mental map of what the idea is and sort of look past the taglines that people have presented of the bill. Because if it is a bill, for example, to provide more military funding to Ukraine, a lot of people are going to skip right to these impacts: famine, destabilizing the region, cutting ties with Turkey. Um, but they lack the link of stepping back and saying, how is this tied to what this bill literally does? And so you're over here debating impacts, you're debating how does impact A impact B, and that just gets very confusing. In fact, I said the word impact right after the word impact in that last sentence, and that's a sign that things are getting too complex. So it's good to get back to basics in these late round speeches and just reframe things around what the bill actually means, because that's what your competitors should have been doing, but it is often something that you'll find a little bit lacking. Um, and so then you have these sort of concurrent ideas of fresh rhetoric and fresh ideas. And so they're a little bit different because your fresh rhetoric is going to be based on what other people have done. Because congressional debate rhetoric is very unique to congressional debate. And so you're not going to hear it elsewhere, and judges aren't going to hear it elsewhere. And so stock rhetoric has really taken off recently. And again, that's not something that we should love or hate, but it does put a premium on being sincere and earnest in your convictions. And so comparison with other debaters is going to harm you 9 times out of 10 in a late round scenario. If you feel the need to be calling your competitors like venal or greedy, or that they don't care about human impacts, it's going to ring a little bit hollow because even though there are people arguing oftentimes on the sides of bills that we don't consider very favorable or that we would consider to be a really bad idea, they're still rooting them in human impacts because that's what congressional debaters do. And so even if you have like a typically conservative policy, like keeping the minimum wage low, for example, or cutting funding for public broadcasting, most of the time congressional debaters are not going to be making the Fox News argument for it. They're going to actually find liberal rhetoric to ground their argument. And so it doesn't make sense to come in at the end of the round and say, everybody else cares about dollars, I care about lives. If you were actually in the US Congress, maybe that would be true, but for the most part, you're debating against like well-meaning idealists who are teenagers. And it is rare to hear them openly espousing rhetoric that is condemnable. And so in that situation, or in light of that, you don't need to make those comparisons to other debaters that call them bad people, which I think has become super popular in late round speeches because it catches the eyes of the judges and it keeps things fresh. And I understand that instinct, and that instinct is good. And the instinct is to keep the conversation going in a way that hasn't been established before. But sometimes that can become a race to the bottom and trying to say the most shocking thing possible with your late round rhetoric. And I unfortunately think that's too much of an import from our actual politics, which are rhetorically broken. And so there are better things you can do for yourself and for the round than just saying, if you care about people, you would never acknowledge the arguments of the other side because caring about people should be the expectation. And it isn't always, but you have to act as though it is. You have to steel man your opponents to a certain extent, as opposed to straw manning them. So you have to accept that even though you might not think their arguments are coming from a place of good faith, or you might not think that they're rooted in a good philosophy, you have to be able to argue against them as if they were. Because otherwise, you are holding yourself and your own arguments sort of over everybody else in a way that I think loses steam pretty quickly. Like if you believe that your contentions are inherently superior, then you're not going to do as good of a job debating because you're not going to take other people seriously. And so, even if in your heart of hearts you do not think there is anything close to a good argument in favor of increasing funding for nuclear energy, you have to pretend that there is. And so, you should highlight your philosophical differences with other debaters as opposed to highlighting the good person, bad person juxtaposition that gets so tired by like day two of a major congressional debate tournament. And I think this is something that is really missing in a lot of rounds. And that's highlighting philosophical differences. And that's something I never did for so long. I would just make arguments rooted in impacts that I thought were important, which they tended to be. I used to do a lot of international stuff, a lot of immigration-based stuff. And in those cases, there are human impacts that I think genuinely do matter. And most people would identify them as genuinely mattering. But then I rested on those laurels to assume that you couldn't really disagree with my points from a moral perspective. But I think that that only got me so far. And so something that I changed is I started highlighting philosophical differences between one side and the other side. And because of that, I think that it allowed me and other people who've pursued this to be a little bit more charitable to the other side. So you take the idea of, say, the neg as having a legitimate philosophy and the ath as having a legitimate philosophy. And if you pit those two against each other and then explain really well how, in this case, the ass philosophy is more applicable, then your rhetoric is going to be really strong. And so by rhetoric, in this point, I don't just mean like the taglines after you make an impact or after you warrant your evidence. I'm also referring to like the increasingly long intros and conclusions that a lot of people have. Don't just explain how this granular bill has this tiny problem in subsection A. Explain how the concept behind this policy is rooted in a philosophy that you don't think people should be supporting. And so the most common one that I've been identified, and I talk about this a lot in various topics, including rent control, gun control, and the debt ceiling. And so this is my favorite sort of piece of philosophy. And by philosophy, I don't mean like you have to be reading what like Jean-Paul Sartre has to say about whether or not we should have an arms embargo on Saudi Arabia. I mean the way that philosophy is used in like punditry or in like a presidential debate when they're like, oh, what's the philosophy behind that? Like, what is your approach? And so the one critique of approach that I think has been super helpful to me in a manner of thinking, and so you can use this if you'd like, you don't have to, obviously, it's better to draw from what you believe, but it's the idea that in American politics, too many fixes happen at the last minute, right? So the government either manufactures a problem or fails to stop a problem, allows it to progress to like 11:59 on the doomsday clock, and then swoops in at the end with a really clunky fix. And so it's like the anecdote of whether or not you should be designing things to work or whether or not you should be testing them to see if they do work after they've been designed somewhat sloppily. And I think that in American politics, we pursue the second often. So we create this gun crisis where we have over 600 million guns in the United States since 1950 that have been circulated. And instead of trying to solve that problem where it exists, you see so many policies that are focused on the very end of the line. You see so many policies that are focused on once somebody has a gun and has violent intent, which should never be aligned in a society that is serious about its citizen safety. But once somebody has the alignment of violent intent and a weapon that can do a lot of damage, then we have to find ways to stop them. Then we're going to have like really militaristic policing and all these security features in schools, and we're going to have all these new bulletproof implements and stuff. And those are probably, in some cases, ideas that should be considered because they do serve a legitimate purpose and they do have a legitimate impact, but also they represent not solving a problem and then trying to acknowledge the problem after it's been created. Rent control, I think, is super similar. So a city like New York, which does have rent control, or Boston, which doesn't have rent control, but are sort of having the debate in other ways about which direction in which to take that, have manufactured housing shortages. They have zoning policies that state that anywhere between 50 and 70% of buildings currently standing in those cities could not be built today, either because they don't have enough parking, or because their capacity is too high, or because they're too tall, or because they have like mixed use units. And so a housing shortage has been manufactured by draconian laws that don't make sense. And then after that housing shortage has been created, the city sits back and says, oh, look, housing costs are too high. We're going to mandate that private landlords cannot charge market rate for their tenants. And while we might not be sort of weeping for the rights of those landlords to like take the highest prices from their tenants, the fact is that in every industry, you have a market that is determining pricing. And it is better to focus on the supply and demand rates that are going to change that price with ease rather than looking at a price you don't like and saying, okay, this price has to be different. And so that's what I think rent control represents. It represents a fix that goes on the back end of bad policies rather than a fix that sort of tries to reform those bad policies. And so that's a philosophical difference that I try to explain all the time. I say we shouldn't do things that like justify the fact that we made bad decisions in the past. We shouldn't try to make manufactured bad situations or manufactured hardship for constituents more accommodating. We should just try to eliminate that hardship because as the government, we have the power to do so. And so that's a philosophical difference that I think is super common, but there are so many others that you can find as well. And I think I'm taking this in the wrong direction. But I'll go back to the start to sort of talk about some summary. And um, here we go. So talk about some summary and just explain the biggest tension that I see in late round speeches. And so in summary, there are a lot of different methods you can pursue in late round speeches, but they all rely on putting credibility into the words of your fellow senators or representatives and using that credibility to amplify the shrewdness of your own arguments. So you have to have a degree of trust in what people have already said. And you have to be discerning about it, obviously, because not everything everybody says is going to be right. But the more you can do to win ideologically in a situation where either both sides are right or neither side is right, the more you're going to benefit. Because a lot of rounds end up being a wash where there are big believable impacts on both sides. For example, electric vehicles. You have big believable impacts about how nasty the mining of cobalt and lithium and titanomagnetite is. And then on the other side, you have these impacts about how bad it is to have gas and diesel cars. And they're both really true. And so you're going to hear massive numbers thrown around, and it's going to end up being a bit of a wash. Or you have these plausibility debates where it's like, how is China going to react to this? How is Mexico going to react to this? How is India going to react to this? And that relies on game theory, which necessarily puts you in a place where you are concerned with plausibility. And so when you're having those fights over plausibility or over massive impacts, the best thing you can do when you don't know what your judges have agreed with and what your judges have disagreed with is play your cards such that you can be right when the maximum amount of other people are either right or wrong. And so you can reframe that by introducing your dichotomies, which I've highlighted. You can introduce your philosophies so that even if the like minor quibbles of policy might be confusing, you can still have people agreeing with your philosophy. You can use rhetoric uh, to your advantage to appear either more moderate or to paint the proposals of the other side as being more radical than they have been presented already in the debate. Or you can introduce a new layer of analysis that um, crystallizes or that synthesizes the arguments that have already been made, preferably on both sides. So I think late round speaking is super important. Like late round speaking is about clarification and it's about letting people leave the room, judges, spectators, coaches, everybody, competitors, informed about the topic. And congressional debate, as much as it is meant to be a venue for competition, is also meant to inform. And so if people are leaving informed, then you've succeeded. And late round speaking should do that. So you should be trying to pile a lot of information onto these speeches that takes into account that people already have context from other speeches and that uses that context to your advantage. And so I would say the most important thing here overall is to introduce those clarifications with the methods that I've highlighted in this presentation and to really focus on that informative aspect. And I think that's going to get you far, and it's going to permit you to rise above the fray of, as I've said, like the petty squabbles of what is this bill going to achieve here? What's the plausibility of whether or not it's going to have this impact? And I think that is how a late round speech can win, or I think that's how it can do well, if it rises above the rest of the debate and gives the judges a new way of thinking. And so that's something that's difficult to pull off. It's something certainly I struggle with, but it is a good roadmap for how you can differentiate yourself as a late round speaker. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. My email is Rhys, Rhys Adams, Adams 24 at iCloud.com, and I'm happy to respond to any questions. So thank you very much.